Hi, my name is David Kronk. I'm a senior here at Sunset High School. For this Group 4 video, I looked at Bandura's social learning theory and how it applies to video games and violence. I've always been interested in video games, I always played my whole life, and I was not considering myself a violent person, so it was interesting to see how video games do impact violence.
Hi, my name is Kate Oz. I'm a junior at Sunset High School, and for this Group 4 project, I reviewed and analyzed a study done by Psychological Today. And I'm interested in this topic because I like video games.
Hi, my name is Vivek and I'm a sophomore here at Sunset High School. And for this Group 4 project, I reviewed and analyzed a study completed by the American Psychological Association. And throughout my childhood, I really loved playing video games, and this was a really interesting topic, I guess, to dive into.
For this year's Group 4 project, we decided to look into electronic gaming. Specifically, we'll be looking into the claim of a psychological link exists between violent video games and violence. Through the rest of this video, we will be exposing the truths behind this claim and analyzing the research studies that support this claim. In today's gaming world, 90% of video games contain some form of violence. From Assassin's Creed to Call of Duty or to Grand Theft Auto, these violence-containing video games are flooding households. Basic knowledge from the study showed that 91% of U.S. children play some form of a video game, with an increase to 97% for ages 12 to 17. From the American Psychological Association, they state that, quote, the research demonstrates a consistent relation between violent video game use and increases in aggressive behavior, aggressive cognitions, and aggressive affect, and decreases in prosocial behavior, empathy, and sensitivity to aggression. The study reviews research focusing on violent video game studies published between 2005 and 2013. However, a major issue is that the primary studies focus on young adults of 18 and older. The study completely misses the 97% of 12 to 17-year-olds who play video games. To compensate for this issue, the APA provides a set of guidelines and characteristics for the systematic evidence review. This allows the evidence the APA utilizes to reach the conclusion to be accurate and precise. In today's world, acts of mass homicide are usually pointed towards gaming habits and the surroundings of the perpetrator. These violent video games play with the minds of the user. It causes the user to grapple with the feelings and decisions about vengeance. Within video games, first-person perspectives impact the player's mind the most. It increases the player's identification with the character and misleads the user to believe that they are the character. This part of cognition and planning is linked to the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. In addition, the rostral anterior cingulate cortex and amygdala is also affected. The players suppress their emotional response to cope with their violent actions. On top of it, the user is awarded many rewards throughout video games, triggering the release of dopamine. This causes the user to correlate violent actions with rewards. By analyzing and poking holes in the APA statement, we were able to understand the strengths and flaws in their arguments. Based off everything so far, the claim made by the APA is accurate and shows that violent video games do contain a psychological link with violence. Now on to Kate.
Psychology Today describes the hundreds of studies which support the connection between violent media exposure and increased aggression. 3 core reasons were examined to support why violent video games cause more aggression than violent TV shows. One being that violent video games require the user to be active, while watching TV is more of a passive activity. Active players catch on to the mechanics behind actions, such as loading guns or dueling with swords, which can result in a person that further understands what it takes to administer violent activity. Secondly, as Vivek mentioned earlier, players of violent video games are more likely to identify with a violent character. Lastly, violent video games have a greater psychological effect on people because they reward such violent behavior. Not only does this encourage violence at a greater prevalence, but it gives the idea that killing is a positive. To conclude, Psychology Today picks apart studies which have specifically looked at the effects of violent video games. They examined 136 articles and came to a decisive decision, stating that they do believe there to be a psychological link between video games and violence. Psychology Today states that these studies show that violent video games increase aggressive thoughts, angry feelings, physiological arousal, including heart rate and blood pressure, and aggressive behavior. Violent video games also decrease helping behaviors and feelings of empathy for others.
Both the APA and Psychology Today studies heavily relate to the research done by Albert Bandura on a social learning theory in 1963. In his famous Bobo the Doll experiment, Bandura observed children of similar nonviolent tendencies, then showed some of the children a violent model, some a nonviolent model, and others no model at all. Bandura observed that children exposed to no aggression or no stimulus record much lower results than the kicking, punching children who observed the aggressive model. Bandura concluded that there's a strong correlation between observing violent behavior and replicating that behavior. Later, he also added to the study by showing that observational learning cannot happen without cognitive processes which mediate whether or not a response is acquired. These cognitive factors are attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation, and all four have been covered through our analysis of video gaming. We've uncovered the attention that comes with first-person gameplay, the countless hours children spend to retain their violent model's behavior, the physical violence that can be replicated in video games, and the dopamine release that links violence with rewards and keeps kids motivated. With the connections from social learning theory to video games, we can see that the basis of the two examined studies is accurate and backed with psychological proof. Considering both the studies and Bandura's work, we conclude that there's a strong correlation between violent video games and violent behavior. Here is our mind map, which shows the causes for the positive correlation between video games and violence. In the top left, we see social learning theory and the four stimuli needed for observational learning. In the bottom left, we see that video games are active, mostly due to the first person's perspective that video games offer. In the top right, we see the tendency to identify with the violent character within the video game. Lastly, in the bottom right, we see the vicarious reinforcement and release of dopamine that violent video games exhibit.